Well, it looks to me like there's going to be a Republican wave. There was an interesting article actually on CNN where it's called 5 Scary Numbers for Democrats. And what they point to is that Biden right now has a 42% approval rating. 61% of the American people say he hasn't focused on the key problems. So this is called the out of touch index. 51% say the economy is the number one issue compared to only 15% for abortion. And then 78% say we're on the wrong track. I don't think I've seen a right track, wrong track index that was so negative. And 75% of the country says we're in a recession. So, when you look at polling numbers like that, it must translate, I think, into a Republican wave. And you have now Real Clear Politics currently has the GOP gaining 4 Senate seats. So winning in Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, and New Hampshire, that's a big change from just a couple of weeks ago, and winning 31 House seats. So this is kind of what it's looking like right now. But look, the margin is still within the margin of error on the polling. So Nate Silver has pointed out that within one standard deviation, you could either have a Republican wave or you could have basically the Republicans fizzle out. So it's going to be very close, but ultimately, I think this breaks Republican.
Yeah, to me, the way that I'm looking at it right now is that it seems like most scenarios, the Republicans will have the majority in the House. And the real question is what happens in the Senate. It's really, really kind of a coin flip. And that's going to be really interesting to see. So, things where I thought would break Republican in the Senate, like Pennsylvania, are now back to almost a statistical dead heat. So it's a really interesting moment, actually. But most scenarios, David, I think you'd agree, is that the Republicans win the House, and then there's a plurality of scenarios where they also win the Senate.
The House will almost certainly go Republican, but I think the Senate now, the official percentages are 55% likely to tip Republican. But I just think that in a wave year like this, where the wrong track sentiment is so high, I think all these races that are a dead heat, they're more likely to break in one direction as opposed to like a random distribution, right. Which is why I think you could just as easily end up with, instead of it being a 51-49 Senate, it could be 55-45 because all these things could break the same way. So right now, I would slightly disagree in Pennsylvania. I think Oz has improved as a candidate. Fetterman did that debate, and since he suffered that stroke, he kind of came across as somebody.
Well, how do we feel about that? I had very, very hard to watch that happen, and yeah.
I mean, the guy has suffered a stroke and is sad, but he doesn't present as someone who can be a senator right now. I think Oz is going to win that race.
What does the science say about that? Like, are we as a society, is this a good idea to have somebody post-stroke be in office? I'm not picking any political side here. I'm just talking about the medical issue.
Oz is actually doing the right thing right now, which is he's not actually focusing on that issue because it's so obvious. He doesn't want to be seen as beating up on Fetterman, and instead he's focusing on,
it's a human, yeah.
He's focusing on the issues. And actually, Fetterman's issues are very unpopular in a state like Pennsylvania. So I actually think for both reasons, Oz is going to win that. I think Fetterman's manifestly unqualified, but also I think his positions are fairly unpopular. So I think Pennsylvania will almost certainly tip.
So let me pull up the chart here just so people can see.
Ohio is going Republican. And then Arizona, I think, is really the interesting one where Blake Masters is now tied. After being behind Mark Kelly throughout this campaign, he is now tied in new polling at 47.
Oh God,
yes,
he's so
tied.
Unpopular. Your guy is really unpopular. And now he's tied?
He was never that unpopular, J-Cal. That was your interpretation.
It's the Peter Thiel way.
He was doing really poorly, I think, because he was anti-choice.
I think that Arizona is probably going to be the closest race in the country. I think it's going to be a nail biter, but I think Blake's going to pull that out.
Sachs, what do you think are the biggest policy shifts that take place in this country post this predicted red wave? Is there anything that changes? So just, talk to folks about what's on the docket from a legislative point of view going into the next Congress with all these new candidates.
The reality is we have a separation of powers in this country, and you're going to have divided government. The Republicans will control Congress. The Democrats will control the presidency. And so as a result, you're going to be largely in a gridlock situation. But gridlock may be a lot better than what we've had over the last couple of years. So, you've had basically this orgy of spending and money printing, and I think that's going to stop, obviously. The other thing that's going to happen is Republicans may not be able to pass much legislation, but they're going to be able to do investigations. And there's a lot of questions that need to be answered, I think, about COVID. These lockdown policies that we had that started at the top at NIH, why did they happen? We need to start having accountability for some of these horrible decisions that were made during COVID. And there's been no willingness in Washington to hold anyone accountable. At a minimum, they need to have some congressional investigations and find out why we pursued such bad policies over the last couple of years.
By the way, did you see what happened this week where the CDC, after this entire opioid epidemic and all of these lawsuits, the CDC came out and actually said, hey, listen, we need to really make sure that we're getting access, putting opioids in the hands of Americans who are really suffering with pain management and whatnot. And I didn't read the article to really understand the details, but I just thought it was an incredible headline where it's like, it's so counter to the narrative of what we've been told is happening, which is like, overprescription and misprescription.
If we learned anything during COVID, is to question every organization, everybody, and to really collect your own information while, looking at these organizations we trusted over time. I know I look at the world differently now that you couldn't say COVID was possibly a lab leak without having your podcast taken down or being banned on YouTube. And now ProPublica has done an investigation and they're saying, along with Vanity Fair, and they're going to win a Pulitzer for this, I bet, that this conspiracy theory from 2 years ago is probably actually the leading theory, and that the Wuhan lab was showing, if you didn't see it, reporting an incident in late November of last year, before COVID broke, 2019.
It's really incredible.
There was an article in The Atlantic that came out over the past week called "Let's Declare a Pandemic Amnesty."
No.
And
let's do a pandemic investigation.
Right. So basically,
investigate everything.
Yes. All the experts who told us, Jason, that we weren't allowed to have an opinion because we weren't expert enough, that if we raise any questions about the origin of the virus, that it might have come from a lab, that basically needs to be censored. The people who said we had to do lockdowns and implemented all these authoritarian tactics, now they're saying that they need an amnesty. And what that really means, no one's looking to criminally prosecute them. What we're looking to do is have some accountability around the public policy. What they want is they want to pull the expert card to say that they're the only ones who get to have an opinion and make a decision. But then when it all goes horribly awry, they basically want to be completely insulated and unaccountable from their decisions. No way. We're not going to give you
full investigation. We're in alignment on this, Sachs.
By the way, can I just tell you why that's
Hold on. I just want to say, Sachs, we're in alignment on this for a rare moment of peace on this podcast. The same thing after 9/11. Shouldn't all Americans understand what happened after 9/11 and what the failures were in our intelligence, just so we can get better? I'm not picking a political horse here, but it's kind of crazy that people have said to our podcast and other people who were questioning it, forget about what political party you're in, just want to understand how the world works. What are the chances that this breaks out in the one or two places where they're studying the coronavirus that you have a lab leak? It was so obvious to everybody.
The other reason why you need to have accountability for this is that there is still a long tail, especially around the damage that we did to our kids educationally.
Yes.
And now the overprescription of stimulants. And so if you don't have answers, you can't go after these problems. Like stimulant prescription is now the single biggest epidemic in children. It is now twice as prescribed as contraceptives and asthma drugs.
And why, Chamath? Why are we doing this? To get them to score higher on a test, to be more attentive in school?
Well, it's actually this negative feedback loop where these children were miseducated during COVID. It had huge psychological and academic damage to them. Our test scores have fallen off of a cliff relative to how we used to do, relative to other countries. I think the teachers' unions have found a way to try to explain it, to basically shield themselves from any sort of critique. And so then part of that loop is then to look at a bunch of kids that are underperforming in school. And instead of saying, well, maybe these lockdowns and masking and all of these things that we implemented actually had a huge impact, they say, you're misbehaving, so let's put you on a stimulant.
Yeah, it's crazy.
We're in that loop right now. Just so you guys know, the data is outrageous. Twice as many prescriptions for stimulants as the sum of contraceptives and asthma drugs for all American kids.
Yeah, it's not that suddenly everybody's got ADHD. It's we failed them. We failed our children, and we're going to use stimulants to have them catch up? No, we should be doing summer schools, after school programs, weekends, whatever.
We failed them because of our response to COVID. That is why we need answers to all that stuff, because you need to link these things together to have some real accountability. Absolutely.
Here is the, just so we have the people see the numbers, here's the 538 poll of how Joe Biden's popularity has switched. This is 654 days into his presidency. Started out really strong, 54%, and now a little rebound since the summer. Obviously, that dip started with the economy. It's the economy, stupid. And if we go down a little bit on this same page and you zoom in on the left there, you can see compared to Donald Trump, he started out much more popular than Donald Trump day by day, and now he's just as unpopular as Donald Trump was at this point in his presidency.
Well, look, the setup is really interesting for 2024 because it's probably going to be the case that we're in the middle of a recession going into that election cycle. Maybe we'll be sort of like getting ourselves out of it, but there'll be a lot of economic damage, high unemployment. And, typically folks in power will have to sort of be held accountable for that. It's a really interesting setup that both Gavin Newsom and Ron DeSantis have to figure out now and navigate if they're going to get the nomination on each side.
And breaking news today, Sachs would love to get your thoughts on this. Axios says, and we'll go to Science Corner next, that Trump's going to announce on November 14th that he is running for president.
Look, I kind of have the Joe Rogan philosophy on this, which is why give it oxygen? Let's just wait and see. There's certainly no need to talk about it before it happens. We're not even past this election yet. But hey, I want to go back to the Biden popularity, because I think part of the issue here is what are the arguments that Biden is making to the country about why people should vote Democratic? And he gave another speech on Wednesday night where he basically claimed that if you vote for a different party, that is a threat to democracy. In other words, the perpetuation of single-party rule is what you must do if you care about democracy. That is a sales pitch that's not going to appeal to anybody outside of the viewers of MSNBC. It's just not. He's not talking about the issues that really matter to the country. What the country wants to know is that he's focused on the economy. He's focused on inflation. He's focused on crime. He's focused on the schools and fixing this learning loss that Chamath was just talking about. He's not doing those things. Instead, he's basically saying that the Democrats should be kept in power forever because there was a riot at the Capitol on January 6th. And look, that was a stain on the country. Okay. It was terrible that happened.
Disgusting,
but that is not a reason. Hold on a second. That is not a reason to keep Democrats in power forever. And actually, there's a liberal guy, a liberal Democrat named Josh Barrow, who wrote a pretty good blog about this. And what he said is, the message is that there's only one party contesting this election that is committed to democracy, the Democrats, and therefore only one real choice available. If voters reject Democrats' agenda or their record on issues including inflation, crime, and immigration, they have no recourse to the ballot box. They simply must vote for Democrats anyway. And that argument is just not flying. And actually, he's a Democrat who is pointing this out. But I don't think that Democrats are getting the message on this, but I think they will after this election, and they're going to have to find a new sales pitch to the country.
Well, and he does have a good sales pitch, doesn't he, Chamath, with these major bipartisan wins. He had the infrastructure deal got done, the technology bill, and the chips. You got gas prices going down. You got GDP growth. You got job growth.
The problem is that those things happened, frankly, too early in his presidency, and things are getting materially worse. So I just sent you a link. Can you just throw this up here for a second? Jason, you mentioned this cheaper gas thing.
Yeah.
But the reality is, if you look at this, we have now depleted our strategic oil reserve by almost 50%.
Yep.
So we are running out of oil that we can introduce into the market at effectively zero cost to bring the price down. And because we've lost our relationships with folks like Saudi Arabia, there's no way to influence them in order to produce more. In fact, they're going to cut supply so that they can control the prices that they have, that they can sell into the market. And so now what are we left with? Well, the only three places where you can have incremental supply of energy, which the country still needs, is from Russia, Iran, and Venezuela. And so, all of these things, Jason, I think come back and really put Biden in a tough place because as Sachs says, he does have to answer to all of these things because these are his decisions. Look, I still believe in the Democrats. I'm hoping I gave $1 million to the Senate PAC, trying to sort of tip the Senate. I really think it's important that we have a split government because I gave up on the House. I think it's clear that the Republicans are going to win, but the Senate is still up for grabs. And the reason is because I think that we need to sort of have stasis so that nothing bad happens between now and 2024, because I think the economic conditions on the ground are going to be bad in and of themselves.
Friedberg,
and then just the one last thing I'll say is the instructive thing that I think we should look at is what happened in Germany. Because what happened in Germany is really interesting. When the economy turns and inflation is out of control and energy is out of control, what they basically did was they sidelined the European Central Bank. They stepped in with their own balance sheet and said, you know what, we're going to nationalize assets. And I know that this sounds crazy to say, but if it can happen in a place like Germany, I know most people would say it'll never happen in America, but I'm not so sure. And I think that you want to make sure that there's a split government so that these things are never possible. And so hopefully there's some, common ground in a Democratic Senate and a Republican House, and we just kind of get through 24 and see where the chips land. And I still think it's going to be DeSantis versus Newsom.
Friedberg, any final thoughts here on politics and relations?
My first observation is that I think it's funny that Chamath and Sachs are funding opposite sides of the electoral cycle.
Yeah, why don't you guys just give the money to me and Friedberg to get a plane?
Throwing each other's money up.
Yeah.
I could think of other ways for you guys to use that money, but
David and I may have canceled each other out. You're right. I mean, So far Peter Thiel made the better trade. It looks like the Thiel wave in the Senate.
So look, I would say my very broad statement is democracies evolve in a cyclical nature over time, right? You often see swings from one political party to the other. And it's just the nature that once someone's been in office, they form the new establishment. And then folks in the next election cycle want to vote against that establishment because there are things that they want that they aren't being given today. And therefore, the democracy forces a change from what is the current establishment back to the other side. And generally, political parties seem to kind of adopt whatever the other side is. And that's how the cyclical evolution of democracy seems to play out. The recent trend that has been more alarming, which I think we can kind of take pause to notice, is the rise of populism, where populism is this really kind of vehement, diehard opposition to elitism and the establishments that everyone feels kept down by and everyone feels taken advantage of by. And the rise of Trump, the rise of Bolsonaro, the rise of Boris Johnson, and I would argue even the rise of AOC, Bernie Sanders, and Elizabeth Warren, all similarly speak to the crying voice of the democratic populations that they want to see these establishments taken apart. They don't feel like they're fair. They don't feel like they're just. They don't feel like the institutions that oversee us and are meant to service us are servicing us. And so there was this big rise. The problem is, like a normal pendulum would swing back and forth between one side and the other. With the rise of populism, you get such a strong push of that pendulum, it can knock through a wall. And I think we saw that on January 6th. And I think it gave a lot of people pause. We saw the motion of Brexit knocking through a wall. And we saw these kind of very radical outcomes. And then the cost of those outcomes blow up in our face. And as a result, I think we're seeing a bit of a receding of the tides right now away from populism during this current electoral cycle, where folks are saying, you know what, maybe we just need to have some sort of an establishment so I can feel safe and secure, less than the volatility that I've experienced of late.
Look, I think you look at the economic mess we're in. Okay, populists did not cause that. Okay, populists did not cause $10 trillion of money printing. It was modern monetary theory and the experts of the Fed who did that. It wasn't populists who created the great financial crisis of 2008 that caused the ZIRP, and we're still living with all the downstream effects of that. It was the experts on Wall Street who said they could manage all these derivatives and the collateralized mortgage obligations and all that stuff that they lost control over.
I would argue
and
that
hold on, and on COVID, it wasn't populist.
The CDC are the experts. Yeah, the CDC are the experts.
And it wasn't. And on COVID, it was not populists who caused the horrible handling of that pandemic, even though they were blamed for it. Remember, we were told it was a pandemic of the unvaccinated. Then it turns out the vaccine doesn't stop it. It was not populists who caused the reaction to the pandemic. It was the experts, the CDC and Fauci and people like that who shut down our economy, who caused the learning loss. It was those experts. So Friedberg, listen, you may not like this populist wave that we have in the country, and I get that, but it's in reaction to something real, which is the failure of this expert class. And if you want to stop having this populist wave rise up, we need to start having experts in position of power who actually know what they're doing.
Well, and one way to say that.
Sorry, Jake, hang on one second. I don't have any opposition to the populist wave. I'm making the observation that the effects of some of the populist movements have started to become too volatile for people to feel like they should continue forward with that electoral path. That was my observation. Okay, I'm not kind of criticizing the populist movement. I'm just saying that events like January 6th and the conditions in the UK, for example, are making people say, wait a second, maybe I need to take pause on the extreme.
The bond market basically fired Liz Truss. I mean, she's not a populist. And, and Bolsonaro in Brazil, he actually just lost. And there was this big narrative that somehow he was going to not relinquish power. And he just announced that he will relinquish power.
Right.
So, some of the stuff that is about how populists pose this great danger, I think, is threat inflation. And that the threat is magnified by elites who want to stay in power. And the truth of the matter is we need accountability for the people in power. And when they set the wrong policies and decisions, they need to be replaced. No more unaccountability.
Yeah, I mean,
I 100%, just to my personal belief, 100% agree. Accountability is what's lacking most across all of these institutions. 100% agree.
Accountability, maybe competence, and also transparency and accountability. Like, I think that's what the public wants.
Well, competence will ultimately be measured through accountability.
If you want to hear,
but there's no. Hold on a second. There's no way to perfectly react to the pandemic, but in your mistakes, owning them and explaining them would be much better than trying to obscurify it and asking for amnesty. Chamath. You're next.
If you want to hear an incredibly interesting interview, because it's very thought-provoking, of a modern progressive, but with a very different mindset, or sorry, maybe you don't want to call him a progressive, but is the president of El Salvador, Nayib Bukele, and he did this incredible interview with Tucker Carlson on Fox News. I encourage everybody to watch it on both sides of the political spectrum. That man is impressive.
Wait, did we just get an admission that Chamath watches Tucker?
I watched that interview.
You watched the Tucker? Oh my Lord!
Jason's head's exploding
right now. Because I try not to be a complete ignoramus.
He's an entertainer.
I like to watch things on both sides, but that interview is incredible. He is unbelievably impressive, and it double clicks into the skepticism that smart people like him, the outsider class, has with the insider expert class. In a nutshell, if you want to see it, I would encourage you to watch this interview because it's incredible. Incredible. Really, really
Jason, the peasants with pitchforks are rising up against this elite class who've put themselves up. They've set themselves up as lords. They want exclusive control over their blue checks. And we're about to overturn this establishment because it is corrupt and it is incompetent.
It would be great if the people who worked for us were competent
back on Megyn
and
Kelly
owned and were transparent. I think that's why people are opting out of this, is they don't feel that there's a level of competence in these institutions, nor ownership and transparency. And it really is frustrating, whether it's education or it's health or and any of these topics we've talked about here on the show.